Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette number 180, where we read and review philosophy papers. Live on air, stuff I have not read before. We just take a look and get a live reaction, see what I have to say. Sometimes it's smart, sometimes it's not. I had opened up some journals. I had just published some new material in the last few days. So wanted to see if what is available. Oh yeah, this ACT analytic, the mark of a good informant. What does that mean? The function of knowledge is to identify informants. So it's like an oracle thing. Maybe I'll look at that. Let's actually. So I was looking at this yesterday when I broadcast last time, and hopefully this is here because that could be interesting. Sounds good. I mean, it's what is that? 14 pages? Yeah, 12 pages. That'd be great. Please be here. Please be here. Boo, why are you not here? Ugh. Come on, people. I wanted to read this paper. Harvard. Don't you have like some open access policy? I also was broadcasting at a different time because, you know what? This is EU friendly, so I don't know if anyone in the European Union wants to watch my show, but search Google for the Catherine Elgin. Let's see. All right, so it looks like a person. Let's see. Can find if we have papers available. Epistemic stuff. 2018, 2019, so this is only updated to last year. That's too bad. That's too bad. Ugh. Alright, that's disappointing. I wanted to read that paper. That sounds exciting. Alright. Oh well, maybe I'll hold on to this for later or something, but I'm rather disappointed now. And let's see. This is, yeah. I mean, I can always get it through other means, but this is the other one. Keep your cat indoors. I just saw these when I loaded up. I was like, you know, this looks like so much fun. It's a reply paper, which is always a little bit difficult because I have not read the other one, but I've had some great reply papers in the past, so. But no availability here. So let's see what happens. If I click on it once in a blue moon, it is available. But it ain't. It ain't. So, I'm disappointed in you, Acta Analytica Publishing folks. Let's see. Eventful Conversations and the Positive Virtues of a Listener. Trading Ontology for Ideology. Ooh. Well, that's 15 pages. I'd avoid that. This is also 15 pages. Let's see what else we got. What is that? What is this special thing? Music ontology in the question of persistence. Back to the branching future. Oh, maybe there's ontology or something special. See what else we have. High individuals and where to find them. Usually just walking around stoned out of their mind. Towards high world semantics for quantified modal logic. If to be is to be the bound variable, okay, Quine. Then the acknowledgement of the denial of the existence of chairs amounts to a serious disagreement of the range of a quantifier. Yeah, because if you put it under a quantifier, then how do you understand it? Because you're saying it doesn't exist, and you've got weird non-existent objects. Hello, Meinong. Absolutism about taste and faultless disagreement. Did I read this one? I read a bunch of. I've read a few papers on this. That's why, in some sense, I'm gonna avoid that because I can't. I found I can't remember papers all that well. It all gets into a mush in my head, and so I don't want to end up reading a paper that I have done that before. I started reading a paper where I'm like, this is familiar, and I got halfway through, I'm like, wait, I did read this. 15 pages, 1 to 7. Imagination, can I justify empirical belief? Yes, but I read this one already. Shucks. You know, I had a bunch of papers. Let's see if I have it. I'm just going to go check the front page. Let's see what we got. New journal articles. If you're out there, please feel free to ask any questions. AJP. Let's see if AJP generally does not publish short papers. In fact, they have a minimum word count, which prevents anything but a reply on their papers from showing up in that journal. So this is 1 to 14. That's kind of cool. 1 to 16. So these are actually short for AJP. Look at that. So we got a few, but they're 15 pages. Let's see. Grounding in the myth of ontological innocence. I read a bunch of paper on grounding. Maybe I'll come back to that. Explanatory information in mathematical explanations of physical phenomena. Ooh, fun. So, alright, I'll look at those in a minute. 1 to 12. 1 to 12. The paradox of duties to oneself. Did I read this? Yeah, to incoherent power to release oneself from obligation. I argue that self-release is possible. Okay, so I've read that. So those are... So if I go below there, it's already stuff I've looked at. So let's take a look at this stuff. It says 129, 1 to 16, and this is 1 to 14. Authority, illocution, accommodation, and social accommodation. N.P. Adams. Don't know who you are, but let's take a look. N.P. University of... And we've got the paper. We might have the paper. This is called Authority. Let's see how many pages it is. 18. Kind of hurts. 18. But it's a reasonable size font, so we will consider it. And let's take a look at this one. 1 is 16. So if this one was 18 pages and this one is 16 pages, let's take a look at that. Ooh. See, 29. No thank you. Yeah, 29, but double spaced. So it's about 15 pages then. So it's slightly actually shorter than this one. Now, does anyone out there have an opinion? Do you want me to read Grounding on the Myth of Ontological Innocence, or do you want to read about authority, illocutionary accommodation, and social accommodation? What else did we have from AJP? Explanatory information in mathematical and physical phenomena. 1 to 14. I'm liking 1 to 14. Please be here. Get access. Nope. No access. That's too bad. I want to read mathematical explanation of physical phenomena. I actually am kind of interested in this. I find these alright, so I'm gonna give you a slightly harder look because I kind of am interested in the topic. Search Google. There we go. manualbarometers.weebly.com. Alright, let's see. Might have to look at you with the nice website. Would you please put your research up on it? Nope, just a DOI link. That's sad. Well, you're not getting your paper read then. Alright, so we are back to grounding versus philosophy of language. Alright, so what are we going to do? We got flip a coin time. This is heads, this is tails. Heads is grounding, tails is illocution. And it is tails. Tails is illocution. Save file. If you want to grab the paper and you are in chat, go right ahead, it's right there. And if you come late, you can always type exclamation point paper in the chat, and the link will pop back up at that point. Okay, authority, illocution, now accommodation, social accommodation by N.P. Adams, penultimate draft, April 2019. See how long it takes to get everything published? It was over a year ago that this is basically done. Okay. J.L. Austin considers a case where someone orders him to pick up wood on a desert island, but he rejects the speaker's claim to authority. This raises the question of whether the claimant would have gained authority over Austin in the absence of the block. What block? When considering a similar case, Thomason suggests so. When no one objected to this arrangement, she became the group leader and obtained a certain authority. She did this by asking if she had the authority. If I command you to do something and you do it without objection, did I just gain authority over you? I don't think so. People be like, there's always things like I can command people, but if they were going to do it anyway, like, did I actually command them to do it? Like, I'm going to command Donald Trump to tweet. Okay? It's like, he's going to tweet one way or the other. So it's like, it doesn't, he's going to do it without objection. So, okay. So we'll see. Ray Langton and others have proposed a mechanism for gaining and granting authority in this manner by drawing on the phenomenon of presupposition accommodation. When an assertion is made that presupposes information that is not part of the conversation's common ground, the audience quite easily and commonly accommodates by accepting that the presupposed proposition is true in order to make the speaker's assertion acceptable. Okay, so it's like, this is when you get like the objection in a courtroom. It's like if they just let it go, but the opposing like defense attorney or prosecutor has to object because it presupposes something. It's like leading the witness, but if they just let the witness lead, then it's in the record that way. Okay, and so that sort of establishes the authority of the fact, and in this case they're using this sort of similar thing to establish the authority of leadership. Analogously, when an illocutionary act is performed that presupposes certain normative conditions are met, the audience may accommodate by changing the context to make it the case that those normative conditions are met, and so the act is felicitous. I call this illocutionary accommodation. When applied to the speech act, command, and the authority required to felicitously issue commands, it looks like it is possible to gain genuine authority by illocutionary accommodation. Yeah, so if you just go along with like this, I think this shows up, it's been showing up lately, and I've noticed it more, of course, is like when you have like speech, hate speech, and people just go along with it, like racist jokes. Does that establish the racist sort of premise or the presupposition? And so does that give that sort of thing power, and have you then given the person speaking it the same power to define such things? The possibility that genuine authority can be gained by accommodation is surprising from the perspective of moral and political philosophy, where authority is taken to be prima facie objectionable and difficult to attain. It certainly does not seem to be the case that any time a practical directive is introduced into a conversation and not rejected, the speaker gains authority over the audience. This strongest interpretation of how we gain authority by illocutionary accommodation seems false, but it points to an interesting direction. If we expect audiences both to resist the demand for deference implicit in authority claims, and to avoid conversational disruption, there should be a mechanism for handling practical directives that doesn't require ceding authority to someone, or even more radically admitting that they attempted to claim authority. Yeah, this gets into the area of manners and etiquette. Like, if someone says something out of place, how do you call them out? So, I propose such mechanism extending Langton's use of the accommodation framework to what I call social accommodation. That's called etiquette. In many circumstances, audiences will accommodate a speaker by not granting them authority, but by interpreting them as not claiming authority in the first place. Social accommodation is the general practice of the audience changing the context in order to bring the speaker into conformity with norms beyond those strictly concerned with speech acts. Our attention will be on norms related to authority, including issues such as autonomy, equality, hierarchy, and deference. Once we see this extended framework, however, its use beyond questions of authority becomes apparent. Alright, here's the plan. In Section 1, I explain presupposition, accommodation, and Langton's extinction of the idea. In Section 2, I consider the norms and values at stake in authority relations. This shapes our understanding of the conditions for conferring authority in particular normative systems, and demonstrates how we should think through the possibility of successful illocutionary accommodation beyond the case of command. In Section 3, I turn to social accommodation, showing how it gives audiences a way to handle practical directives that will often be preferable to illocutionary accommodation. I also argue that further theorizing social accommodation should improve our understanding of how interlocutors negotiate norms. Alright, so this basically looks like, to me, is what we're going to do is, this is a philosophy of language of etiquette paper, which is kind of cool. I haven't actually seen a speech act theory of etiquette, although I expect there is a literature on this somewhere that I haven't seen. Because, I mean, other languages have very specific norms and regulations on how you can interact, about what sorts of things are said and what in what position. Yeah, and feel free to ask questions along the way, but as I always say, this is my first time reading it, so what authority do I have? I'm just reading stuff. Illocutionary accommodation is supposed to work in a manner similar to presupposition accommodation. We begin with the familiar idea of a conversation's common ground, the set of propositions accepted by all conversational participants together. Meaningful utterances attempt to update the common ground. For example, assertions attempt to add a proposition. Imagine we were having a conversation about lunch plans and I say, "My sister left yesterday." The main information tries to add to the common ground that my sister is gone. I have no idea what that means, actually. If you're having a conversation about lunch plans and you said your sister left, what is that relevant? Are you saying something weird? I don't know. But it also includes and presupposes that I have a sister. Well, does it? Maybe you're being insane. That's it's very weird. I don't understand why you're talking about lunch and then your sister. But what? Alright, continuing. One way of putting this... I have a sister. The assertion will only make sense if you accept that information. One way of putting this is that presuppositions are requirements that sentences make on the common ground. More broadly, speakers make requirements on the audience with their utterances. The audiences are driven to make sense of the utterance because of how they view the speaker. If the common ground does not already include what is presupposed, then the conversation might veer off track. Perhaps you challenge my presupposition. Hey, I thought you said you didn't have any siblings. Or perhaps you explicitly confirm the presupposition. Oh, you have a sister? But conversations understood as cooperative projects are driven by a norm of smooth, on-track progression towards a shared aim. Our lunch plans don't hinge on whether I have a sister or whether I misreported whether I have a sister in the past, so we can achieve our aim of coming to a successful plan without going into sibling tangents. If you simply accept what is presupposed, at least contingently, we can achieve our goals. This is presupposition accommodation. You effortlessly, quietly, and without fuss, and by default, accommodate requirements my utterance makes on our conversation in order for it to be an acceptable intervention from me as an interlocutor. I don't know about that. I mean, we effortlessly and without fuss by default. No, I don't inherently just assume things people are saying are true. It depends what they're saying. It really depends what they're saying, because if they're saying some racist crap, which happens plenty nowadays, I don't really want to hear it, and I don't accept what they say. I mean, if they're saying things that are innocuous, then yeah, but that's because the nature of the statement isn't innocuous to begin with. I don't automatically do it. It's just that most people aren't being jerks when they're talking. Some people are being jerks, and you shouldn't accept that stuff by default. Accommodation removes the obstacle of an apparent norm violation by a smooth progression forward in Tomlinson's useful characterization. Accommodation works because the audience's consideration of the speaker's utterance happens in stages. As von Fintel explains when discussing accommodation's apparent retroactivity, an utterance's proposed primary update requires that the context include certain elements at the time of the update, not necessarily at the time of the utterance. Yeah, okay. The audience first notes the speaker's intervention as a manifest event, going on to interpret it as a meaningful utterance of a certain sort that has certain requirements. If one or some of those requirements are not already met, the audience may then change context to fit those requirements, as in presupposition accommodation. Only then will the utterance proposed primary update be considered and the context potentially shifted again to include it. In our example, you first register my utterance and its requirements, one of which you accommodate by accepting that I have a sister. Then the primary update can be considered, and it might be challenged while accepting the presupposition. Oh, that's the woman who was in your office yesterday. I thought I saw her again this morning. As we will see, illocutionary and social accommodation further exploit this space between utterance and update. Okay, yeah, so someone says something, and then the person updates what they are thinking about what's going on according to the new thing you said. That's basically the update stuff, which is fine. But I mean, how you update is, I'm not buying exactly how you update, but this is generally the framework, this update semantics or whatever it's called. I forget. Just as some sentences require that certain propositions hold in order to be acceptable, illocutionary acts require that certain conditions hold in order to be felicitous. Illocutionary accommodation, in my sense, is the process of changing the conversational context so that the felicity conditions on an attempted illocutionary act are met. The illocutionary act of command has authority as one of its felicity conditions. Commands aim to change another's normative standing just by expressing the intention to do so require the power to change normative standing in that way. The argument from Langton and others, then, is that when audiences accommodate a command, they change the context so that the speaker has the required authority. There is a crucial difference between accommodating presuppositions and accommodating commands in the sense I just described. When you accommodate my assertion's presupposition that I have a sister, you do not make it true that I have a sister, you simply accept the proposition that I have a sister. In this case, changing the context to fit the presupposition is a matter of accepting the proposition that I have a sister, not changing the facts about my family. Yeah, so this is a bracketing thing. You said you had a sister, I'm accepting that in sort of like a bracket, in the sort of like hermeneutic tradition. You sort of understand that as something that is a sort of a conditional acceptance of the proposition. So it's a conditional thing. It's like, I'm accepting this for the conversational, for the sake of argument, or for the sake of the conversation. Okay. The parallel argument would then seem to be accommodating someone's arrogation of authority, simply a matter of taking an attitude of acceptance towards the proposition that they have authority for the purpose of the conversation. Yeah, so it's a conditional granting of authority here. Here, the illocutionary accommodation is treated as a strict parallel to presupposition accommodation, and all that changes is shared acceptances. But accommodating a speaker in this manner does not seem to entail that they thereby gain genuine authority. Actually having authority is different from both someone acting as if you have authority over them, perhaps you have successfully deceived them about your authority, and from merely having influence similar to an authority's. The idea of gaining authority by illocutionary accommodation is something stronger. Langton argues that authority's existence comes into being through accommodation, not only its acceptability. And again, a presupposition of authority cannot be just acceptable, but true, because its existence, not only its acceptability, depends in part on what hearers do or fail to do. Here, illocutionary accommodation involves changing more than whether the audience accepts that some felicity conditions are met. It involves changing the world to make it true that the felicity conditions are met. Alright, so alright, let's continue. See where this is leading. Presupposition accommodation can work because adopting an attitude of acceptance towards a particular proposition is under the direct control of the audience. But presupposition accommodation cannot make it true that I have a sister, because the audience has no control over the pieces of the world that would constitute my family relations. As Thompson puts it, people can be accommodating, but the world cannot be. So why think illocutionary accommodation in the interesting, stronger sense can work at all? Although the world is not accommodating on its own, people control some parts of the world. The felicity conditions on commands include authority, but authority is a matter of social norms, and so involves a particular audience accepting propositions about who has social standing of various sorts. As Langton puts it, actual authority can be constituted by actual acceptability. In Section 2, we consider how authority is related to acceptance. In elements of the social world are under the control of the audience in the same way that their attitudes of acceptance are under their control. Thus, it might be the case that an audience's accommodation of the speaker's requirements not only changes a common ground, but the speaker's normative standing in the world. Yeah, so if you just start accepting one thing someone says as an authority, then another, basically, I guess you could say once you become habituated to their being an authority, maybe that just is them having authority then over the listener or the audience, if the audience becomes habituated to accepting the things that they say. I think this basically plays out a lot of times in politics. You hear people not really being authority, or they have the air of an authority, and then they say stuff and people start to accept it because, well, they must know they are an authority, and then it's sort of self-propagating once this sort of social structure has already been set up. Of course, the authority at that point is somewhat dubious. Okay. When focusing on authority, illocutionary accommodation looks like a relatively small extension of presupposition accommodation. Since authority is itself a matter of shared acceptances, all that happens is the audience's shared acceptances constitute authority as well as the common ground. The audience still only exercises control over what they accept, but in specific cases, shared acceptances play more than one role. To my mind, however, illocutionary accommodation is a broader phenomenon. Here's an example of illocutionary accommodation that involves the audience exercising control over a part of the world that is not about what propositions they accept. My friend Alicia wants to buy a cappuccino but left her wallet at home, so I agreed to loan her $5. Where do you live that a cappuccino is $5? Like, seriously. Like, I'm in New York. Sometimes it's $5, sometimes it's not. But, like, why wouldn't you just buy her $5, the cappuccino? Anyway, I mean, it could be $5 depending where you are. A felicity condition on loaning is possession of the amount to be loaned. It might be common knowledge among my interlocutors that I don't have $5 to hand. So my friend Billy rolls the dice and gives me $5, which I then hand over to Alicia. Billy accommodated my attempt to loan by meeting a felicity condition that happened to be under their control. And, as is often the case with accommodation, it is the very act of ostentatiously flouting the felicity condition that calls on the audience to do the work that the speaker hasn't done. This is still illocutionary accommodation because Billy is not just assisting me in a general sense, but specifically removing an obstacle from the success of speech act by ensuring that one of the felicity conditions are fulfilled. Understood in this broader way, a main question for illocutionary accommodation concerns the varieties of audience control. Some illocutionary acts and some felicity conditions will be able to be accommodated, but others not. The illocutionary act of marriage, for example, includes some felicity conditions under the audience's control, such as the absence of attendee objections and the consent of the spouses, but some that are not under the audience's control, such as whether the spouses are people, not penguins. Sometimes audience control is also much more circumstantial. Billy has $5, so controlled whether or not the conditions that I possess $5 would be met, but had Billy just spent all their cash, my attempted loan could not have been accommodated in the moment relative to the goal of getting Alicia cash for her cappuccino. The question of gaining authority by illocutionary accommodation is whether the normative standing of authority is under the right kind of control of the relevant audience. Authority by accommodation. Presented in this way, it becomes clear that the phenomenon of gaining authority by illocutionary accommodation will resist easy classification because whether an audience has the right kind of control over the conferral of authority depends on the normative system in question. Authority is a particular kind of normative standing that will be defined in different ways, including the conditions on its attainment and conferral in different normative systems. We can see this clearly by comparing legal systems. In a constitutional system, the possession of the authority of a particular type, say the authority of the chief executive, can only be had by going through explicit, well-defined public procedures that the Constitution sets out. In a democratic system, this will involve an election. No amount of accommodation can grant someone the legal authority of the chief executive in that particular system of positive law. In a monarchy, by contrast, it could be the case that the monarch's accommodation is sufficient to confer genuine legal authority on someone who riskily implicitly claims it by acting as if they have it. The difference lies in the higher order norms about the possession of standing within the system. The constitutional system is set up so possession of political authority is institutionalized and explicit, while in the monarchical system, control over legal standing is personal and whimsical. Well, I don't know about whimsical, but personal, so could be implicit in the manner of accommodation. The question of whether authority of a certain sort can be had by accommodation within a certain normative system depends, then, on the nature of the system. This is mostly a sociological inquiry. Our philosophical inquiry into the authority by illocutionary accommodation proceeds along two distinct lines. First, a philosophical characterization of authority can help us understand what sort of norms and values practices of authority are instantiating and responding to. As an example, authority presumes a justified hierarchy, so authority should be easier to retain in systems that already accept pervasive hierarchies. All else equal, we should expect authority by elocution to be more common in such systems. Second, precisely because practices of authority instantiate and are shaped by questions of value, we can articulate what practices of authority should look like according to our best understanding of those values and how they interact. This stance provides a standard by which sociological practices of authority can be evaluated and critiqued. Sure. You can look at, the sociology of authority. There's a bunch of research on that sort of thing. The different rules for conferring authority in different normative systems depend in part how the system in question is trying to balance the various value questions involved in practices of authority. To understand these values, it is first important to narrow the scope of our inquiry. Not all cases of introducing a practical directive into a conversation are cases of attempting the illocutionary act of command. Langton sometimes expresses interest in the broader phenomenon, but there are clearly distinct speech acts at play, which especially matters for what illocutionary accommodation can accomplish. Consider the differences, for example, between telling someone not to steal because the law or the Ten Commandments forbid it, and telling them not to steal because you told them not to. Both introduce practical directives into a conversation, but they ground the force of those directives in different sources. Precisely because of this act, these speech acts have distinct felicity conditions, and so accommodating them by making it the case that the felicity conditions are met will be quite different. I'm reminded of Conan the Destroyer, the movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And at one point, Mako, who plays this wizard, tells this other thief not to steal, and the man immediately steals something. And he goes, "I know when to steal and when not to," because he just grabs something and they just keep on going, and it's like, okay. So it's this sort of problem right here. This not to steal because the law of the Ten Commandments. All of these things fail the authority there. So it was just an interesting question of where did the authority come from to tell someone not to steal, and why should they accept it? And he then transfers the authority. I forget his name. He's also in Silence of the Lambs. He's a good actor. He transfers the authority to himself, and when his knowledge, he transfers it to an epistemic thing, which is another point I want to bring up, is that this is reminding me a lot of epistemic injustice and like grounds for testimony. Who has the authority to grant people the standing to make testimony, and testimonial injustice. So I wonder if that's where this paper is going, as a sort of a testimonial injustice and things like that, because this is exactly where the testimonial injustice goes, because certain people are not granted the authority to give testimony, which is basically a speech act. So let's see where we're going. The command based on my say-so requires that I have the normative power to change your normative standing just by expressing my say-so. This is practical authority as strictly conceived in moral and political philosophy. Introducing a directive with its source elsewhere does not claim to change the audience's standing, but to inform them of how their standing already is, according to some external set of norms. It does not require the same normative power to bind just by say-so, because it does not claim to bind at all. It only requires the conversational standing to introduce new facts, including facts about what other supposedly binding authorities have to say. This is still a kind of standing that can be accommodated. Suppose a stranger walks by and attempts to insert their views into a conversation, and the interlocutors consider whether to grant the passerby conversational standing or not. But it is not authority. It is not even epistemic authority. Yeah, so here we're going. I need to be a credible informant, not an expert, to successfully introduce information about the existence of other norms. I hope I'm not reading too fast. I was speeding up my reading for various reasons, and now I realize I'm reading faster just in general. Reading faster out loud just in general. Continuing. Authority in the sense I am concerned with is a Hofeldian power to change the deontic standing of another simply by expressing an intention to do so. So Hofeld 1919. I don't know who that is. Interesting. This is the kind of authority that, for example, the law claims over citizens, parents claim over children, and employers claim over employees. It is an essentially relational and agental notion. It cannot be possessed by objects. This is importantly distinct from the broader idea that we take ourselves to be bound by reasons and norms of various sorts, and that we introduce reasons and norms into conversation with others, shaping how we act individually and in concert. This broader idea is, of course, worthy of consideration and study, but it is not surprising that we can accommodate the introduction of norms in this matter, nor controversial. Someone with authority has control over a shared normative space in an especially distinctive way. Authority as Hofeldian power over another centrally implicates a variety of values. First, it involves one person determining how another person can act, so it reduces the scope of the subject's autonomy and self-determination. Second, it constitutes a status hierarchy where one person is superior and the other is inferior. Well, an authority over what is the question? Third, obeying an authority involves deference and a lack of independence. If we value freedom, equality, and independence, authority is prima facie problematic and should be difficult to justify. On the other hand, we think there are natural status hierarchies or people who deserve to have very little or no autonomy in their lives, then authority that reinforces those hierarchies and controls those kinds of people should be easy to justify. If we think social control is of utmost importance, and so deference to figures of authority should be people's default attitude, then authority will also be easy to justify. Yeah, this is getting into the politics again. It's like if you're having more of an authoritarian political structure, then you just have to have deference to the social controls. Which is interesting. Of course, this is all very interesting in our current state of the United States of America at the moment, with all the fun news recently. And by fun, I mean terrible. The surprising idea at the core of authority by illocutionary accommodation is that genuine authority can be had easily and implicitly, merely by accommodating a speaker. In normative systems that prioritize freedom, equality, and independence, we should expect authority to be difficult to attain and confer on others, and so authority by illocutionary accommodation relatively rare. But in normative systems that prioritize hierarchy, control, and deference, authority by illocutionary accommodation seems to fit quite naturally. At least with my respect to conferring authority on those higher in the hierarchy, consider a random man being able to claim authority over an unaccompanied woman in a patriarchal context. Normative systems will structure authority practices according to their commitment to the various values at play. This will include balancing some relevant values that are not about authority per se, for example, about whether achieving standing within the normative system can be implicit. I might value hierarchy, order, and conformity in a way that leads me to believe all such relations should be explicit. I would then deny that authority can be gained by illocutionary accommodation because, although it can be gained easily, it cannot be gained implicitly. Yeah, so the method matters depending on your normative system. This is particularly relevant to the question of authority within institutions. Part of the point of institutionalizing a normative system is to make the various roles within the system explicit and well-defined. Although not all systems will make all types of authority resistant to implicit attainment, we should expect this kind of implicit move to be more difficult in institutional settings. It works precisely against the reasons that normative standing of that sort was institutionalized in the first place. Yeah, if grant the power of changing power relations to some sort of speech act, which is inherently based in a person, then you're taking that power away from any sort of institution. So that's a question, like, where is the it's the difference between the, as was said above, the monarchy where the person can just say something and confer power, versus the constitutional system where the Constitution has procedures for conferring power and it should not be otherwise able to do it just by saying something. Of course, unless that was in the Constitution. This can help us see the transition to other philosophical considerations, namely how we can evaluate and critique practices of authority given our best understanding of the relevant values by their balance. Values and their balance? What sort of balance are we talking about here? Authority may be had by accommodation in a monarchy. Hey, this is where we're going. By accommodation in a monarchy, but not constitution. I always like it when I get things right. Woo, I got something right. My shirt's ripped. Just saw that. The idea that but this is precisely one of the objections to monarchy. Legal systems constitute structure and exercise public power. The idea that such power can be conferred by personal whim is objectionable. Well, why? I mean, we tend to think so, but whatever. Not important for this paper. Instead, the attainment and exercise of such power must be regulated by explicit public rules in a process that responds to the will and interest of the persons over whom it is exercised, and so on. So although the question of whether legal authority of certain types can be had by accommodation in certain positive legal systems is a sociological one, from the normative perspective, we can quite straightforwardly say that one justified system of legal authority cannot allow legal authority by accommodation. Legal systems that do so make the possession and exercise of public power objectionably easy and unaccountable. Okay, so I want to make a quick comment on this whole section here. They've been doing a lot of sort of these background sociological reports in this paper, sort of telling us how things are in different systems. And so that's kind of it's a very descriptive project here, even though they're talking about normative stuff. A lot of this background work is laying a very specific descriptive foundation for whatever they're going to argue in the latter half of this paper. So, see, anything else to say about this? I mean, it's just describing the Hofeldian power. Yeah, so this is all just sort of specifying the power that the author wants to talk about. So this whole section 2 is really a descriptive project, and sort of interested where they're going, but yeah, we'll see, I guess. But this is sort of arguments just trying to nail down some sort of something. Let's see. Given the values at stake, given the sort of authority being exercised and on whom it is being exercised over, we can make a claim about how authority practices ought to be. See right here. Now we're finally getting to the ought sort of thing, not descriptive but normative. There are, of course, limits to the level of detail, abstraction, considerations of this sort will give about actual practices. There remain a great deal of space for particulars regarding historical and cultural forms, preferences for value rankings, and similar matters to determine how actual social practices of authority look in particular contexts. But this is within the constraints set by our best understanding of the values at stake. Authority practices that render people too eager subjects or infringe too far in their self-determination or impose hierarchies of gender or race are unjustified. So here's where I'm getting into. See, this is why I said that stuff about the descriptive. The author immediately shifted here to sort of a normative what ought to be. And there's a great deal of space, but this is within constraints of our best understanding of the values at stake. You see, this is basically the structure of how things. This is still a sociological point. This is not normative. This is making an actual claim about what is the values at stake and why we think this. And this is making a claim that certain things are unjustified. Now, I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I mean, generally, I think this author looks like you don't want to impose hierarchies of gender or race, but this is an interesting the first attempt to shift to what they want to say here, and I'm not actually I just have to give them more time to say it. I'm not exactly on board with how they're arguing right here, because this is how things ought to be, and then you're saying just given this stuff but without argument, what is the foundation here? Or are we just still in sort of just describing the status quo, and why should this be the right way? So I don't see an argument here for this sort of shift, actually. Okay, why should we do anything? I don't know. I agree with you, but that doesn't mean we should do it. Alright, continuing. We should expect our best understanding of authority to reject accommodation in most cases. Again, why? Accommodation looks a lot like tacit consent. The problems with tacit consent theories are well known, that's fair. And these problems are illuminating for our cases as well. Tacit consent is only legitimate when the consenter clearly knows what counts as their tacit act and what they are consenting to. If these conditions are not met, then the idea that the subject is reasonably sacrificing their autonomy and the authority can justifiably demand deference from them is objectionable. In most cases, failing to block a command will not fulfill these conditions because it does not demonstrate that the audience knew that they were thereby granting authority over what jurisdiction or what that entails. As such, we have reason to think that the most reasonable practices of authority would not grant authority simply due to accommodation. It might be worried that I'm idealizing authority too much, a strand of theorizing authority forcefully criticized by Langton. Raz, for example, tends to claim that nobody has genuine authority unless they have authority according to the standard I just articulated, that is, in light of the best understanding of the values at stake. But Raz would surely admit that it is coherent to ask about who has authority according to the norms of a particular positive social practice. It is clear that judges have genuine legal authority within an overall illegitimate regime, in contrast to normative citizens of that regime. This fact can be incidentally important for agents trying to balance their reasons and act well. If I want to act efficiently in the context of a particular normative system, it doesn't matter whether the system is all things considered justified. I just need to know who has what standing and how they exercise it within the system. Raz's point is that subjects of normative systems that are not all things considered justified do not have their final practical reasons intrinsically shaped by authorities of such systems, as Langton recognizes. Subjects to the oppressive legal regime do not have overriding practical reason to do what the oppressive law says just because it says so, as it is claimed to authority would have it. Who's Raz here? I don't like Langton. Is Langton Raz? I don't think so. I'm a little confused about who Raz is right here. Because I'm not, again, this is just me being unfamiliar with the literature. Maybe that Raz is Langdon or was referenced above, but looks like the reference got lost in this version. Of course, yeah, and there was just a trending on Twitter yesterday, people basically saying, well, this is just my job, where they had the Nuremberg defense, like, I'm just doing my job, I'm just a cop, this is what I'm supposed to do. Yeah, that didn't work in the past. Maybe it'll work this time. I don't know. It might. America's a weird place. Yeah, again, this is, I feel like this section here, this is an appeal to, trying to describe the appeal to authority, we've appealed to emotion and what people think is the right thing here. And so this is more even though this is starting to shift to the ought stuff, I feel this is sort of getting where the emotional, where we feel that authority should be given and transferred, but that's the only force I get out of this. It's sort of an appeal to emotion here. We've got the ethos, pathos, and I'm blanking on my old words, but like, why should we expect this? This whole appeal is an odd sort of shift in how the argument is going. We went from descriptive sociology, but then this looks like a just more sociology of things, but it's an emotional appeal here, which is interesting. Like I said, I'm gonna probably agree with the author on what is right and wrong on these things, but as far as the argumentative strategy is to argue for what should we do in terms of giving authority, is the emotional appeal the right way to go? No. Again, have to see where we're going with this. Social accommodation. So far we have focused on the level of normative systems because accommodation requires that the audience have the right sort of control over the conditions of having authority within the system. Just put a line right here. Ultimately, however, I think the more interesting work to be done in this area focuses on the level of individuals and the audience. Even in normative systems where audiences have the ability to grant authority by accommodation, they have good reason not to. They often have good reason not to. By explicitly challenging someone's claim to authority is a costly and disruptive conversational move. If we expect to resist granting authority by accommodation, but also to be relatively cooperative interlocutors, we need to show how there is a conversational mechanism by which practical directives can be accommodated without granting authority. It is in the interlocutor's interest to have such a mechanism available in a wide range of cases. By extending Langdon's use of accommodation even further, I propose the phenomenon of social accommodation. Yeah, so here's getting back to the etiquette talk I was mentioning above. How is there because it's very costly, but in what way is this costly? Costly and disruptive. It's an etiquette. It's a cost to the social like fabric. It's the cost of the etiquette. You need to have a way to have a mechanism which let's see. Yeah, I don't know. It's a okay. So, but this is what I'm saying. It's just you need to have some sort of in conversation way to get out of obligations. Continuing. In social contexts where autonomy, equality, and independence are valued, authorities will often resist granting others authority. But even in contexts where subordination, hierarchy, and deference are preferred, only specific kinds of authority will be appropriate. Social contexts with prevalent hierarchies don't grant authority to all over all. They grant authority to specific groups and deny authority to others. In such contexts, then, the audiences especially need the ability to resist granting authority when the speaker is the subordinate class. Imagine a woman issuing a command to a man in a patriarchal setting. Sometimes, perhaps even often, the man may explicitly block the authority. But sometimes it is easier to just go along, and better yet, to go along without granting authority. Yeah, so this is getting into the standing, the epistemic. I read other papers on this, on who has standing to issue commands. And then we've got biases, and you don't grant standing to certain classes of people, women, races, whatevers. On the strongest reading of authority by illocutionary accommodation, genuine authority would be granted any time there was any kind of directive introduced into a conversation and the subject of the directive happened to conform to it. The reading is suggested by the appeal to presupposition accommodation because the presupposition accommodation apparently occurs quite passively, perhaps even whenever there isn't explicit blocking of presupposition information and the conversation continues apace. Alright, so this is probably true, but again, sociologically, I mean, I know quite often when people say things questionable, I'm thinking, do I want to argue? From Craig Ferguson, the comedian and writer and director, producer, it seems like an all-around good guy. He said, look, he had 3 ex-wives, and finally, or maybe only 2, and he was on his 3rd or 4th wife. And he said, finally, I've learned there's like an order of operations here. Whenever you're going to say something, you say, does this need to be said? Does this need to be said by me? And does this need to be said by me right now? So the question of when someone says something you disagree with, do you need to say something right now? Like, does it need to be said by you? Does it need to be said, does it need to be said? Does it need to be said by you? And does it need to be said by you right at that time? Oh, excuse me. I have a mic, or like right here. So this, I don't know, it's like, this is not easy to do, just to do it, to have control over this, but you don't have to do it, passively. This can be something you very specifically have to learn and act on, as he said, and I think he is completely right. So anytime you want to speak, think about those 3 rules. Thank you, Craig Ferguson. Similarly, then, the strongest reading is that whenever the subject doesn't block their directives and goes on to conform it, the speaker gains genuine authority. You see, again, this is my disagreement here. This is a sociological fact, and only in people that aren't actively thinking about these things. Wittek comes closest to the strongest reading when writing that the hearer's cooperative response, that is, his complying with what the speaker has told him to do, involves his tacit acceptance of the speaker's power to give him binding orders. The strongest reading denies the possibility of an intermediate case. The speaker issues a command, and the audience conforms to the command but does not grant the speaker authority. Yeah, this is the conditional authority. The intermediate case is not only possible but preferable, and I think quite common. There is no authority in such cases because although we are willing to accommodate the speaker, we do so without accommodating their implicit arrogation of authority. The explanation for both the existence and commonality of this intermediate practice is precisely the interaction of 2 sets of norms: conversational norms that prefer smooth progression, and social norms against authority relations. This is more than conversational norms. I mean, there could be other goals that are going on. Like I said, social norms against authority relations and conversational norms. I think there's as I was saying, etiquette stuff that is in between all of this stuff. So it's a rather complicated mix of reasons why people do and say things. But yeah, the point is a good point regardless. As I head to my kitchen, my roommate calls out, "Grab me a beer." On his face, this is a command that my roommate lacks the authority to issue. Well, say, "Please grab me a beer." It's a request, not a command. The strongest reading suggests that only two responses are open to me. Either I bring my roommate a beer, guided by the norm of smooth conversational progression. No, you're not being a jerk. It's not conversational progression. You're being nice. And thereby grant him genuine authority over me, or I block the presumption of authority, guided by the norms of autonomy and equality. Neither looks particularly attractive. I don't want to suggest that I am his subordinate by bringing him a beer, but I also don't want to take the somewhat socially extraordinary step of rebuking him for what might be an offhand remark. Again, this is my problem. I say, look, there's other things going on here, because these do seem very extreme options, and so that doesn't seem right. Let's see where the author goes. This latter possibility suggests an intermediate route of social accommodation. I want to interpret my roommate charitably as a speaker, and so I must at least interpret his... Alright, here we go. Charity. Alright, that's important. So we're going to see what they say about charity here, because that's a new concept coming in. So I must at least interpret his utterance as expressing his desire for a beer. I shouldn't just presume he is joking, or more radically simply ignoring him as if he is either absent or nonsensical. But I also want to interpret my roommate charitably as a decent human being and good friend. We know in common that we are equals, both because friendship requires equality in some respects, and because we are both committed to equality more generally, speaking to what I personally value in friends. A decent person wouldn't risk their friendship by violating shared norms or by infringing on the autonomy of their friends. So this is some sort of appeal to something else here, which is kind of interesting. So we have to see where they're going. So to interpret my roommate charitably in these other respects. See, why is charity getting tied to friendship here? It's a little odd. As not violating these underlying moral and social norms. Okay, so charity is going on to moral and social norms. I read his utterance as a request and not as a command. See, that's the question. It's like, why were you going immediately to command? Requests do not require authority as a felicity condition, so I can bring him a beer without granting him any authority, without having to interrupt the cooperative aims in order to rebuke him. Let me say that a little bit better. Why are we prioritizing commanding over requesting as more fundamental? I mean, if you just assume that it was all a request from the get-go, as you are friends, then there is no problem here. I can respect... Requests do not require authority as a felicity condition, so I can bring him a beer without granting him any authority and without having to interrupt the cooperative aims in order to rebuke him. I can respect both sets of norms simultaneously. In this case, social accommodation also renders illocutionary accommodation unnecessary. Roommates and friends have the standing to make requests of each other. Of course, there are limits to such accommodation. On one hand, although most practical directives are ambiguous as to the... Oh dear, I've got a leaf blower guy outside. I hope it's not too noisy for you folks. As to the source of their bindingness, sometimes the speaker will explicitly include the claim of authority. Such a speaker can still be accommodated in a variety of ways, but makes reading the directive as a request more difficult and costly. It often requires interpreting the speaker as either incompetent or insincere in some way. If the speaker continues to reassert their authority, the social accommodation that avoids granting authority is ruled out, because this is what we should expect. The claim is no longer an implicit one that is tangential to the conversation, but it has become a central point of contention. In another case, there are limits to accommodation. Sorry, everything's distracting me all of a sudden. Let me just see if there's anything to say there. Okay, so there's limits, and then you have to sort of find ways out of it. Continuing. In another case, there are limits to accommodation that are especially relevant when considering patterns of behavior. If my roommate is constantly telling me to do things, if he also ignores my requests, if he never requests but always orders, if he never expresses gratitude, and so on, then the defaults should shift, because he is not acting like we are equals, he is acting like he has authority, and I am his subject. How I interpret him is not only a matter of what norms I, as the audience, think are valid, but what my understanding of what norms he takes to be valid is trying to conform to. When we are friends, I presume he is not trying to gain dominion over me, but if he has constantly held himself above me, then it extends charity too far to read him as conforming to those egalitarian norms he clearly rejects. So again, this the notion of charity here is interesting, because it's sort of, charity is a force going towards these shared norms here. Again, what charity means, again, sort of, it depends on what you think the norms are. again, I agree with the author here, but I don't see the force of charity because it's just saying, well, this is reverting to the status quo at this point. So, see, exceeds charity as conforming to those egalitarian norms. But again, whose norms are they? So, I agree with the author. I'm just not finding the argument, again, sociological, not normative, which is probably okay, actually, in the course of this paper. It's sort of a descriptive project. So let's see where we're going. Social accommodation is a natural extension of the general accommodation framework, according to which audiences change the context in order to bring a speaker's utterances in conformity with norms that they would otherwise ostentatiously violate, thereby removing obstacles to the common project. Stallnacher notes, if a statement made with a syntactically ambiguous sense would be irrelevant or manifestly fault on one of the readings, then that reading will be excluded because a conversational maxim would be violated. Here the audience is at pains to interpret the speaker as in conformity with the norms of relevance and truth-telling. Well, maybe relevance and truth-telling, people want things to make sense. In some sense, again, this is conforming to not egalitarian norms, but now coherence in some sense. Likewise, Thomason and von Fintel consider a case where a speaker is in violation of social norms of intimacy and propriety, and both discuss it as obviously a case of accommodation. The speaker uses a more informal greeting than would be appropriate as an attempt to make the relationship more intimate. The audience is accommodating the speaker in relation to norms of propriety. The obstacle is not incoherence or falsity as with the presupposition of accommodation, nor is it infelicity as with illocutionary accommodation, but rude success. It may appear that this is simply a special case of presupposition accommodation, where the audience accepts the proposition that the speaker is not in violation of a social norm, but this isn't quite right. Presupposition accommodation is generally about accepting that the world is arranged some way. Social accommodation is about how the audience and the speaker relate to social norms that apply to them, and in particular, whether the audience has to treat the speaker as having violated some norm. While the audience could take various stronger or weaker stances towards the idea of relating to the speaker, they cannot do it simply for the sake of argument, as in the weakest kind of propositional acceptance. When the audience accepts that they relate to the speaker in a specific way, this immediately structures their ongoing interaction. As they continue the conversation, they will treat the speaker in the new way and thereby actually relate to the speaker in that way. And they are responsible for that treatment. Yeah, so once you start treating someone differently, then that's kind of on you. All accommodation is social in some sense. My notion of social accommodation is simply supposed to highlight that audiences hold speakers to a wide variety of norms beyond the conversational norms, and will change the context to accommodate in this way as well. Audiences may want to interpret speakers as polite, committed to equality, pious, law-abiding, and much else. Accommodation therefore has to be considered holistically. Often the audience is choosing which norms to put the speaker in greater or lesser violation of, not to render the speaker completely free of norm violations. This is simply due to the wide extent of relevant norms. As Stallnacher's example makes clear, audiences accommodate by considering the utterance at a variety of stages prior to the update. They might change their understanding of the speaker's meaning, purpose, sincerity, or intended illocutionary force. In general, the audience will exploit ambiguities in utterances to give themselves a wider variety of interpretative options so that they can treat the speaker in the way they want. So they will exploit ambiguities. I don't know if I'd call these sort of things ambiguities. Well, no. What the author said here is correct. But there's sort of there's different ways to interpret things sort of on purpose in some sense in terms of etiquette and other options. They're not really ambiguities, but they're opposing forces that sort of at work, opposing norms. You don't have to listen to somebody, and that doesn't make what they said ambiguous about you granting them authority. It could just be that different things are happening at once. And so when different things are happening at once, then yes, you didn't grant them authority, but that doesn't mean there was an ambiguity in what was said. They attempted to clearly set themselves up in authority, and they didn't get it, but that didn't make you did, exploit an ambiguity. You may have exploited a social norm that allowed you not to give them that power, even though they tried to. So in that sense, it's a failure of the Illocutionary Act. Ouch. Anyway, continuing. Social accommodation is not necessarily a good thing. It is simply about how the audience may interpret utterances in order to bring the speaker into conformity with different sets of norms. Yes, this is back to the descriptive project. Oopsie. This one. Consider the following more pernicious case from Rebecca Kukla. Celia is a floor manager at a factory. Now I've got the leaf blower person right outside my window. Celia is a floor manager at a factory where most of the workers under her remit are men. Celia has a problem. When she issues orders politely and on the basis of her authority, the workers often fail to comply and consider her overly presumptive. Even when they conform, though, they are resentful. One explanation is that they are just sexist and refuse to obey a woman. But Kukla offers another explanation, namely that the workers are reading the commands as requests. I think this is right. They are accommodating Celia in precisely the sense I articulated above. Celia cannot have authority according to the prevailing patriarchal norms. Further, this explains why some of the workers' hostility towards Celia. She thinks she's giving orders that they are obliged to obey, but they think they're doing her a favor by agreeing to her requests, and for which she should express gratitude. Yeah, see, this is the epistemic injustice or testimonial injustice, that she can't issue commands. So I did just read a paper on this. Well, everything's in the last few months. But yeah, I don't have it off the top of my head. But basically, they discuss these sorts of problems here. I don't think it was Kukla specifically that I read, but it was someone else went into detail. Kukla argues that the problem is an absence of conventions ascribing authority to women. This doesn't explain why the workers make extra effort of reading the orders as requests. As Thomason notes, there is a general rule that one shouldn't claim authority one doesn't have, but then it seems that we should just ignore and perhaps censure those who claim authority they don't have. If a woman claims authority and the prevailing norms tell us women can't have authority over men, then disobedience, not accommodation, seems to be called for. Characterizing the workers' response as a social accommodation is a friendly addendum that helps us further analyze the case. If this is a case of accommodation, then we should be on the lookout for additional potential norm violations that are removed by the audience's reading. Using Kate Mann's understanding of the relevant terms, Kukla's case involves both a patriarchal ideology that puts women under men in social hierarchies and a misogynist ideology that makes women liable to punishment for stepping out of their place in the hierarchy. If the workers merely disobey, they are implicitly recognizing the claim to authority and command. But for a woman to claim authority over men is for her to step out of place according to the patriarchal norms, which then would necessitate punishment according to the misogynist norms. But punishing Celia would also be costly since they really are her subordinates. The workers not only want to interpret Celia as not having authority, they want to interpret her as not even claiming authority because of the surrounding norms. So they accommodate Celia by interpreting her commands as requests, thus by rendering their work situation consistent with their commitment to patriarchy. Here, social accommodation is being performed because and in support of the prevailing patriarchal and misogynist norms. Celia's male audience charitably refuses to interpret her as a woman stepping out of her place. This fits well with Mann's analysis of misogyny because the workers may not be motivated by hostility to Celia or women in general, and may in fact feel protective of Celia and want to avoid the punitive repercussions. But it is the presence of misogynist norms that the workers apply to Celia that sets the conditions for the seemingly amicable treatment in the first place. Kukla argues that this is a case of discursive injustice where Celia is unable to perform a certain kind of illocutionary act due to systematic unfairness in the surrounding context that inhabits her agency and affects her life quite broadly. Social accommodation reveals a way in which injustices in general can be compounded and upheld. Even when speakers intend to challenge various norms, their intent might be stymied and their utterance neutralized precisely because the utterance is presumptively norm-violating. The audience is both motivated to avoid norm violations and has social accommodations available as a mechanism to do so. The more important the norm is taken to be, the more motivation the audience will have to interpret the speakers as not violating the norm. Violations of some norms are so beyond the pale that the audience will accommodate the utterance by rendering it something else entirely, even perhaps nonsensical, rather than entertain the possibility of a good faith challenge to the norm in question. Social accommodation is thus a distinct mechanism by which prevailing norms resist change. Okay, so I think, as I said early on, we've got a philosophy of language version of, what was I saying? I can't even remember. It's an hour ago now. So we've got some philosophy of language going on here, and how power relations can change in these things. As we got towards the end, this is basically where I thought they were going, is they're going for the sort of injustice, going towards the injustice literature, for this discursive injustice, where someone is not allowed to do something that they have the right to do, according to some structure. And so, the social accommodation, I'm having a little bit of a... Well, actually, let me talk about what was good, and then I can get back to my criticism. So what was real nice about this paper is they laid out this whole thing. They've got like this whole like history, sort of the philosophy of language sort of structure, not the history, but sort of like this philosophy of language sort of background that can work to really pinpoint what is going on in these sorts of structural issues with power. So you're really laying out all the power relations and all that sort of stuff going on in this sort of from a philosophy of language perspective, in sort of the Illocutionary Act, what is happening when someone attempts to give an order and it's either succeeding or failing. So that's very, very good. The question, of course, is exactly where are we going with this? And so by laying all of this out, I'm not sure how far we've gotten. I had that complaint between the sociological account and the normative account. What should be done about this, or how does it actually function? Basically, the conclusion down here is that the social accommodation is thus a distinct mechanism by which prevailing norms resist change. Basically, yeah, but did we not think that like people didn't act to accommodate social issues? I mean, of course people do that. So I'm a little... Maybe I missed something, but it's like this is giving the more philosophy of language version of how this is working in the philosophy of language of social accommodation, which is great. That's very good. But the question is, how do you interpret, say, like a statement that just you can't... you're having a lot of trouble understanding because either the person is lost their mind or something, like they had an aneurysm, or it just can't, or otherwise it's just so terrible that you don't want to like accept it. And so then you try to figure out what's going on. And so the real question then is, what sort of a normative force is that behind this? And this author calls this a social accommodation. I was just calling it etiquette. How do you... breaches of etiquette and like social things, how do you describe breaches of etiquette? And so we've got different etiquettes here. If you've got a different sort of society, you're going to have different sorts of etiquette, what women can and can't say, what men can and can't say in different situations, and things like that. But see, here's the thing. We've got the norms. So it's like, given certain norms in the society, what is the limit to the person's ability to make certain requests of other people? And that's commands. And so what's the limit of the etiquette in some sense? Where does the charity extend to? And basically, they made the argument, of course, earlier, that in a monarchy you can do one things, and in a constitutional democracy you can do other things. And so it's basically dependent on the system. Sure. Completely agree. So for that, this is a good paper in the sense that we got the sort of philosophy of language spin on this this topic. And I like that. I personally would have liked a little bit more of the force behind how charity is to be understood in terms of where the limits are and how do you push back. Like, how do you push back against bad things? In this case, like, we've got this bad thing, and how would one push back? Where is the force going, and how does the force blocked? How does that work? Because that's sort of what would be interesting to me, because I'd want to know how do you do something with this, as opposed to just sort of the sociological history of these things. If you want to fight against someone trying to assert their power, how much leeway do you have, and how does that work? And that's what was my complaint about the comment that it was ambiguous. I don't think certainly some things are ambiguous in these situations, but how do you actually understand what's going on, and what's a failure to assert power as opposed to an ambiguity in what's being said? You might exploit an ambiguity to resist someone's power, but that's only one way to do it. And so that's kind of like where what I would have. I mean, granted, this is a fine paper; it has nothing to do with what I want. But like, this is just, it's an interesting thing. It's like, we've got how do you, like, this is this beer thing, like, why would you assume your roommate's ordering you? I mean, granted, is, as they said below, is it a power play? Do they constantly order you to do things? And then in that case, you're doing something different. But it's the context here is the history here really matters, not the context. Of course, context matters, but the history also makes a difference. But again, not ambiguous. So how is that actually the power being taken and received? Now, of course, you can do it sort of like taking on a presupposition, but again, do we take things on, as I was saying, conditionally? And so conditional power relations. Yeah, okay. So that's about all I have to say for now. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, concerns, suggestions for what I should read, or the Philosophy Roulette more generally, please let me know, and have a great day. Stay safe out there, folks.